The iron shackles bit into her wrists as Josephine stood on the auction block in the dusty town of Laramie, Wyoming Territory, wondering if death might have been kinder than whatever fate awaited her now. It was July 1876, and the summer sun beat down mercilessly on the crowd of men who'd gathered to bid on human cargo. Josephine kept her eyes downcast, her rounded cheeks burning with shame as the auctioneer's voice droned on about her supposed virtues. She was 20 years old, and her body carried extra weight that made her feel like a prize cow being sold at market rather than a woman. Her dark hair hung limp and dirty around her face, and her dress was little more than rags after 3 months of running and hiding before being caught. "Do I hear $50? The auctioneer called out, his voice sharp in the afternoon heat. Josephine had run from her stepfather's farm in Missouri, where he'd worked her like a mule and beat her when she displeased him. She'd thought freedom lay somewhere in the West, but hunger and desperation had driven her to steal bread from a merchant in Cheyenne. The law had been swift and harsh. Without money to pay her debt, she'd been sold into indentured servitude, which was just slavery by another name. A figure moved through the crowd, and Josephine caught a glimpse of him. He stood head and shoulders above most men, with broad shoulders that strained against his buckskin shirt. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, slightly wild and untamed. His face was weathered and tanned from years in the sun, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days of beard growth. His arms, visible where his sleeves were rolled up, were corded with muscle that spoke of a life of hard physical labor. $200, the mountain man's voice rang out, deep and commanding. The crowd fell silent. It was an astronomical sum for someone like Josephine. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with greed. 200 going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in buckskin. Josephine's heart hammered in her chest as the mountain man approached. His eyes were a striking gray-blue, like storm clouds over the mountains, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, and his presence was overwhelming. Thick muscles defined his chest and arms, and he moved with the confident grace of a predator. The sheriff removed her shackles and handed them to her new owner. "She's all yours, Callum." Callum. So that was his name. He took the shackles but didn't put them on her. Instead, he tucked them into his belt and gestured toward a wagon at the edge of the square. "Come on." Josephine followed on trembling legs, acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. She climbed into the wagon bed, expecting to be told to sit there like cargo, but Callum surprised her by offering his hand to help her onto the bench seat beside him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. He said nothing, just clicked his tongue at the 2 sturdy horses and guided them out of town. Josephine sat rigid beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She watched the town of Laramie disappear behind them as they headed into the wilderness, following a rough trail that led into the mountains. They rode in silence for over an hour. The landscape grew wilder and more beautiful, with pine trees reaching toward the sky and rocky peaks looming in the distance. Josephine had never seen country like this. Despite her fear, she felt a small flutter of wonder. Finally, Callum spoke. "What's your name?" "Josephine, sir," she answered quickly. "Josephine Crawford." "You do not have to call me sir," he said, his voice still gruff but not unkind. "Callum is fine," she nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You hungry?" The question caught her off guard. Yes." He pulled the wagon to a stop near a small creek and retrieved a bundle from the back. He unwrapped it to reveal bread, cheese, and dried meat. He handed her a generous portion without comment. Josephine stared at the food, then at him. "Is this for me? You said you were hungry." She ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some dignity, but hunger won out and she devoured the food. Callum ate his own portion in silence, watching the mountains rather than her. When she finished, he handed her a canteen of water. "Thank you," she said again, meaning it deeply. They continued their journey as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The trail grew steeper and more narrow, winding through dense forest. Josephine wondered where they were going, how far from civilization his home must be. As dusk painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, they emerged into a clearing. A sturdy cabin stood there, built of thick logs with a stone chimney. It was larger than she'd expected, well maintained, with a barn nearby and a corral holding several horses. Smoke rose from the chimney, which confused her until she realized he must have banked the fire before leaving. Callum brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down. He came around to her side and offered his hand again. Josephine took it, feeling the calluses and strength in his grip as he helped her down. "This is home," he said simply. She looked around, taking in the tidy yard, the vegetable garden, the orderly woodpile. Whatever she'd expected, it wasn't this level of care and organization. Callum led her toward the cabin. Her heart began to race again as she crossed the threshold, uncertain what would be expected of her. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, with a large stone fireplace, sturdy furniture, and shelves lined with books. A bearskin rug lay on the floor, and the whole place had an air of masculine solidity. He gestured toward a chair at the table. "Sit." Josephine obeyed, watching as he stirred the banked coals and added wood to the fire. The flames caught and grew, casting warm light through the room. Callum turned to face her, and Josephine braced herself for what would come next. She'd heard stories of what men did to women they purchased, and her body tensed with fear. "I need to make something clear," Callum said, his gray-blue eyes meeting hers directly. "You will not be a servant in my house." Josephine blinked, certain she'd misheard. "Sir." "I said not to call me sir," he reminded her. "And I meant what I said. You are not my servant, you are not my slave, I do not believe in owning people. But you purchased me," she said, confusion warring with a desperate hope she didn't dare trust. "I did," he acknowledged, "because if I had not, someone else would have. And I know the kind of men who were in that crowd today. I know what they would have done to you." Josephine's eyes began to sting with unexpected tears. "I do not understand." Callum pulled out a chair and sat across from her, his large frame somehow both intimidating and reassuring. "I went to town for supplies. I heard about the auction. I could not." He paused as if searching for words. "I could not leave you there." "But $200, she whispered. "That is so much money." "It is just money." He leaned back, studying her. "You will stay here and you will be safe. You can help around the house if you want to, but it will be your choice. You will eat well and have a warm bed and no one will hurt you. That is all." "Why?" the question burst from her. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Something dark flickered across Callum's face. "I had a sister once, Sarah. She was kind and gentle and full of life. When I was 20 and she was 18, she was taken by raiders while I was out hunting. By the time I tracked them down," his jaw clenched, "I was too late. I swore that day that if I ever had the chance to save someone, I would. So when I heard about you, I came." Josephine's tears spilled over. "I am so sorry about your sister." He nodded once, sharp and pained. "That was 5 years ago. Nothing will bring Sarah back. But you are here and you are alive, and that matters." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging between them. Josephine wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "You do not have to say anything." Callum stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out blankets and a pillow. "You will sleep in the bedroom. I will take the floor out here." "No." Josephine stood quickly. I cannot take your bed. The floor is fine for me. You are taking the bed, he said firmly. It is not up for discussion. But Josephine, the way he said her name, gentle but brooking no argument, stopped her protests. You have been through enough. You will sleep in a proper bed tonight. Please. She nodded, overwhelmed by this strange, gruff man's kindness. He showed her to the bedroom, which was simple but clean, with a large bed covered in quilts and furs. A window looked out over the darkening forest. There is water in the pitcher if you want to wash, Callum said from the doorway. And there are some clothes in the trunk that might fit you. They were, he paused. They were my mother's. She passed 2 years ago. You are welcome to them. Thank you, Josephine said, her voice thick with emotion. Callum, truly, thank you. He nodded and pulled the door closed, giving her privacy. Josephine stood in the center of the room, hardly believing this was real. She moved to the trunk and opened it carefully, finding several dresses, undergarments, and a nightgown. Everything was well made and carefully stored. She poured water into the basin and washed as best she could, scrubbing away weeks of grime and fear. Then she slipped into the nightgown, which was a bit tight across her ample chest and hips, but still far better than the rags she'd been wearing. She climbed into the bed, sinking into the softness with a sigh of relief. Through the closed door, she could hear Callum moving around, the crackle of the fire, the small sounds of him settling down for the night. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. Who was this man who had saved her? What kind of life awaited her here in these mountains? Despite everything, despite all the fear and uncertainty, Josephine felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt safe. And as exhaustion finally claimed her, she slept more peacefully than she had in months. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. For a moment, Josephine could not remember where she was, and then it all came flooding back. The auction, Callum, the cabin in the mountains. She sat up slowly, wincing at the soreness in her muscles from the long wagon ride. Sunlight streamed through the window, bright and clean. She rose and dressed in one of the dresses from the trunk, a simple brown calico that fit reasonably well, though it pulled a bit across her rounded stomach and full hips. She'd always been large, even as a child, and years of hard work and poor food had not changed that. She braided her long dark hair as best she could without a mirror and stepped out of the bedroom. Callum was at the stove, his back to her. He'd clearly been up for hours, as evidenced by the fresh water in the buckets and the tidied room. He turned when he heard her. "Morning," he said. "Coffee." "Please," she answered, moving toward the table. He poured her a cup from a battered pot and set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her. The portions were generous, and once again Josephine felt tears threaten. When was the last time someone had simply fed her without expecting something in return? Callum sat across from her with his own plate. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly. He was probably around 25 or 26, with weathered skin that spoke of years outdoors. His arms, bare below his rolled sleeves, were thick with muscle, and his hands were large and scarred from hard work. His hair, dark brown and slightly wavy, touched his shoulders, and his beard was trimmed close to his jaw. He was not handsome in a conventional way, but there was something compelling about him, something solid and real. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Better than I have in months," she admitted. "The bed is wonderful, but I truly feel bad about you sleeping on the floor." "The floor is fine." "I have slept on worse." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. Then Josephine gathered her courage. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Callum looked at her, those gray-blue eyes thoughtful. "That depends on what you want." "What I want." The concept was so foreign she almost laughed. "No one has asked me that in years. I am asking now." Josephine set down her fork, thinking, "I want to be useful, I want to earn my keep. You spent so much money to free me, and I want to repay that somehow. You do not owe me anything." "But I want to help," she insisted. "Please, let me do something. Cooking, cleaning, mending, anything. I will go mad if I just sit idle." Callum considered this. "If you want to help, I will not stop you, but it is your choice, Josephine, not an obligation. Do you understand the difference?" "I do," she said, and she meant it. "And I choose to help." "All right, then." He stood and began clearing the dishes. "I need to check the trap lines today and tend to the horses. You can do whatever you like around here. If you need anything, there is a rifle by the door, and the nearest neighbor is about 5 miles south if you follow the creek." The fact that he was trusting her with this information, that he was not locking her in or binding her, spoke volumes. Josephine nodded. "I will be back before dark," Callum said. He grabbed his hat and headed for the door, then paused. "Josephine, do not be afraid here. This is your home now, too." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the cabin. Josephine spent the morning exploring her new surroundings. The cabin was well stocked with supplies, and she found flour, salt, beans, and various preserved foods. The shelves held books on trapping, survival, and, surprisingly, poetry. She ran her fingers over the spines, marveling at the collection. She cleaned the cabin thoroughly, swept the floors, washed the dishes, and made the bed. She found that she enjoyed the work when it was her choice rather than something forced upon her. In the afternoon, she ventured outside, taking in the beauty of the mountain clearing. The air was clean and crisp, scented with pine. Birds sang in the trees, and she could hear the distant rush of water. She found the vegetable garden and spent some time weeding and watering. The plants were healthy, showing that Callum had been tending them regularly. She picked some carrots and potatoes, planning to make stew for dinner. As the sun began to lower, she heard the sound of hoofbeats. Callum rode into the clearing on a large bay horse, and even from a distance, Josephine could see the easy confidence with which he sat in the saddle. He dismounted in a fluid motion and led the horse to the barn. By the time he came inside, she had stew simmering over the fire and fresh biscuits warming. "Something smells good," he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "I hope you like stew," Josephine said, suddenly nervous. "I found vegetables in the garden. I am sure it is wonderful." He washed his hands and face in the basin, then sat at the table. She served them both, and they ate together. Callum complimented her cooking, and Josephine felt a warm glow of satisfaction. They talked a little about his day, about the trap lines and the beaver population, and she found herself genuinely interested. Over the next few weeks, they fell into a comfortable routine. Callum would rise early and tend to his work, trapping, hunting, and maintaining his property. Josephine would manage the household, cooking and cleaning, tending the garden and preserving food for winter. In the evenings, they would eat together and talk. She learned that Callum had been living alone in these mountains for 3 years, since his mother's death. His father had died when he was young, and he'd learned to trap and hunt from an old mountain man who'd taken him under his wing. He was largely self-sufficient, going to town only a few times a year for supplies and to sell his furs. He was quiet by nature, but not unkind. When he spoke, his words were thoughtful and measured. He never raised his voice to her, never made her feel small or stupid. He treated her with a respect she had never experienced before. Josephine found herself watching him sometimes, admiring the way his muscles flexed as he chopped wood, the concentration on his face when he cleaned his rifle, the gentleness in his hands when he mended a torn shirt. She noticed the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, the lines that appeared at the corners of his eyes when he smiled, the deep timbre of his voice. She told herself it was gratitude she felt, nothing more. But her heart knew differently. One evening in late August, a storm rolled through the mountains. Thunder crashed and lightning split the sky, and rain pounded against the cabin roof. Josephine had never been afraid of storms, but this one was particularly violent. She was sitting by the fire, mending one of Callum's shirts when a tremendous crack of thunder made her jump. The needle pricked her finger and she gasped. Callum looked up from the book he was reading. "You all right?" "Just startled," she said, examining her finger. A small bead of blood welled up. He set down his book and crossed to her. "Let me see." She held out her hand, and he took it gently in his much larger one. His touch sent an unexpected jolt through her. He examined the tiny wound with serious concentration. "You will survive," he said, but there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "I have endured worse," she agreed, trying to match his light tone, but he did not release her hand. Instead, his thumb brushed over her knuckles, a feather-light touch that made her breath catch. His gray-blue eyes met hers and something passed between them, something electric and undeniable. "Josephine," he said quietly. "I." Another crash of thunder interrupted him, and the moment broke. He released her hand and stepped back, running his fingers through his hair. "I should check that the barn door is secure," he said, already moving toward the exit. "It is pouring rain," Josephine protested. "I will be quick." He grabbed his coat and disappeared into the storm, leaving Josephine trembling by the fire. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart race. What had just happened? What had he been about to say? When Callum returned, soaked to the skin, he changed quickly into dry clothes and retired to his bedroll without another word. Josephine lay awake in the bedroom for a long time, listening to the storm and wondering. The next morning, there was a slight awkwardness between them. Callum was more quiet than usual, and Josephine found herself uncertain what to say. They moved around each other carefully, like dancers learning new steps. It was Callum who finally broke the tension. He was preparing to ride out to check his trap lines when he turned to her. "Josephine, I want to apologize if I made you uncomfortable last night." "You did not," she said quickly. "I was not uncomfortable." He studied her face. "No, no," she confirmed, meeting his gaze steadily. Something shifted in his expression, hope and uncertainty mingling. "Good, that is good." He left then, but the atmosphere had changed. The awkwardness transformed into awareness, a heightened consciousness of each other that colored every interaction. Josephine caught herself taking more care with her appearance, pinning her hair more neatly, choosing the dress that fit her best. She watched for Callum's return each evening with anticipation that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with longing. She noticed him watching her too, his gaze following her movements as she worked, lingering on her face when she laughed, softening when she hummed while cooking. The air between them grew charged with unspoken feelings. One afternoon in early September, Josephine was hanging laundry when she heard shouting. She turned to see 3 men on horseback riding into the clearing. They were rough-looking, with wild beards and hard eyes. Her blood ran cold. The leader, a man with a scar across his cheek, grinned at her. "Well, well, what do we have here?" Josephine backed toward the cabin, her heart pounding. "You need to leave. This is private property." "We are just looking for a little hospitality," Scarface said, dismounting. "Maybe some food and drink, and whatever else you are offering." The other 2 men laughed, and Josephine's fear spiked. She turned and ran for the cabin, hearing them give chase. She made it inside and grabbed the rifle by the door, turning to point it at them with shaking hands. "I said leave," she commanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Scarface held up his hands mockingly. "Now, darling, no need for that. We do not mean any harm." "I will shoot," she warned. "Will you?" He took a step closer. "You ever killed a man before?" Before Josephine could answer, a voice like thunder rolled across the clearing. "But I have." Callum stood at the edge of the clearing, his rifle aimed steadily at Scarface. He must have heard the commotion and come running. His face was set in hard lines, his eyes like flint. "Callum," Scarface said, recognition and wariness mixing in his expression. "We did not know this was your place. Now you do, leave. We were just leave. Now, before I decide you are threatening what is mine." The possessiveness in his tone sent a shiver through Josephine, but not from fear. The three men exchanged glances, then mounted their horses. They rode off quickly, and Callum did not lower his rifle until they were out of sight. Then he turned to Josephine, and the hardness melted from his face, replaced by concern. He strode to her and gently took the rifle from her trembling hands. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "No," she managed. "I am fine. You came in time." "I heard voices." His jaw clenched. "I should not have left you alone. I knew there were men in these mountains who could not be trusted." "You could not have known they would come here," Josephine said. "And I am all right, truly." But her legs suddenly felt weak and she swayed. Callum caught her, one strong arm around her waist, steadying her against his solid frame. She found herself pressed against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart, the warmth of his body through his shirt. "Josephine," he breathed, and she looked up to find his face very close to hers. "I was so scared," she whispered. "Not for myself, for what might happen before you could stop them, for what it would do to you if you were too late again." His arm tightened around her. "I would burn the world down before I let anyone hurt you." The intensity in his words, in his eyes, took her breath away. "Callum, I know I should not feel this way," he said roughly. "I know you are here because you have no choice, because I bought your contract, and any feelings you might have could be nothing more than gratitude or obligation, but I stop," she interrupted, placing her hand on his chest. "Stop talking." He fell silent, looking at her with such raw vulnerability that her heart ached. "Do you really not know?" she asked softly. "Do you really not see how I look at you, how I wait for you to come home each day, how I care about your opinion of my cooking, your comfort, your happiness?" "Josephine," he said her name like a prayer. "I choose to stay," she said firmly. "Not because I have to, not because I am grateful, though I am. I stay because I want to be here, with you. She took a breath, gathering her courage. "I am falling in love with you, Callum." For a moment he just stared at her. Then he cupped her face in his large, calloused hands, tilting her head up. "I have been in love with you since the day I saw you on that auction block, looking so afraid but so fierce. I knew I had to save you, but I never expected you to save me too." "How did I save you?" she whispered. "By making this cabin a home, by bringing light into the darkness I have been living in, by being brave and kind and beautiful." "Beautiful," she almost laughed. "Callum, I am not, you are," he insisted. "You are beautiful, Josephine. Your eyes, your smile, your softness, everything about you. I love every inch of you." And then he was kissing her and the world fell away. His lips were warm and gentle, reverent, asking rather than demanding. Josephine melted into him, her arms coming up to wrap around his neck. The kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more passionate, years of loneliness and longing pouring into it from both sides. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Callum rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. Josephine's eyes flew open. "What? Marry me?" he repeated. "I do not want you here as some indentured servant or kept woman. I want you as my wife, my equal, my partner, if you will have me." Joy bubbled up inside her, so intense it was almost painful. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Callum, I will marry you." He kissed her again, then lifted her clean off her feet, spinning her around. She laughed, giddy and overwhelmed, and when he set her down, they were both grinning like fools. "We will go to town next week," Callum said. "Get a proper preacher. Do this right." I do not need anything fancy, Josephine said. I just need you. You will have me, he promised. For the rest of my life, you will have me. They went to Laramie the following week, and Callum bought her a simple gold band. The preacher married them in a small church, with the blacksmith and his wife as witnesses. Josephine wore the best of his mother's dresses, and Callum wore clean clothes with his hair neatly tied back. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Callum kissed her with such tenderness that Josephine felt tears slip down her cheeks. They were happy tears, joyful tears, tears of disbelief that such happiness could be hers. They stayed in town one night at a modest hotel, and Callum was gentle and patient as they came together for the first time as husband and wife. He worshipped her body with hands and lips and whispered words, making her feel cherished and desired in ways she had never imagined possible. When she expressed uncertainty about her size, her softness, he silenced her with kisses. "You are perfect," he told her firmly. "Perfect for me. I love your curves, your softness. I love everything about you, Josephine. Do not doubt that." And in his arms, in the safety of his love, she began to believe him. They returned to the mountain cabin, to their home, and settled into married life. The awkwardness that had existed between them as employer and employee or savior and saved dissolved completely. Now they were simply Callum and Josephine, husband and wife, partners in every sense. The days grew shorter as autumn progressed, and they worked together to prepare for winter. Callum taught Josephine to shoot, to recognize animal tracks, to preserve meat and vegetables. She proved a quick learner, and he often praised her skills, making her glow with pride. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Josephine often mending or knitting while Callum carved or read aloud to her. Sometimes they would simply talk, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future. Other times, talking gave way to kissing, to touching, to making love on the bearskin rug before the fire. Josephine had never been so happy. Every morning she woke in Callum's arms felt like a gift. Every shared meal, every shared task, every shared moment of laughter or quiet companionship added to the deep well of contentment growing in her soul. Winter came early to the mountains that year. By October, snow was falling regularly, and by November they were snowed in. But Josephine did not mind. The cabin was warm and well-stocked, and she had everything she needed within its log walls. Callum was attentive and affectionate, never taking her for granted. He would come up behind her while she cooked and wrap his arms around her waist, pressing kisses to her neck. He would pull her into his lap while they sat by the fire, holding her close. He told her he loved her multiple times a day and showed it in countless small ways. In December, Josephine began to suspect she was with child. Her monthly courses had stopped, and she felt queasy in the mornings. When she was certain, she waited for the right moment to tell Callum. It came on a snowy evening just before Christmas. They had finished dinner, and Callum was adding wood to the fire. Josephine watched him, her heart full of love for this strong, gentle man who had become her whole world. "Callum," she said softly, "come sit with me." He came immediately, settling beside her on the bench and taking her hand. "What is it? You look serious." "I have something to tell you," she said, suddenly nervous. "I hope it will make you happy." Concern flickered across his face. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," she assured him quickly. "Everything is perfect. Callum, I am going to have a baby." For a moment he just stared at her, then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen. "Truly, truly," she confirmed, laughing at his joy. "We are going to be parents." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "Josephine," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "a baby, our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. "Happy." He pulled back to look at her, and she saw tears in his eyes. "I am the happiest man alive. You have given me everything, Josephine. A home, love, and now a child. I do not deserve you." "You deserve everything good," she said fiercely, cupping his bearded face in her hands. "You are the best man I have ever known, Callum. Our child is blessed to have you as a father." He kissed her then, pouring all his love and gratitude into it. When they finally pulled apart, he placed his large hand gently on her still flat stomach. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "I am your papa, and I promise to love you and protect you for as long as I live." Josephine felt tears slip down her cheeks as she watched him, overwhelmed by the depth of her love for this man. Winter passed slowly but comfortably. Callum became even more protective and attentive as Josephine's pregnancy progressed. He insisted she rest more, took on extra chores, and fussed over her health constantly. She found it endearing, even when it was slightly annoying. By the time spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Josephine's belly was round and prominent. She felt the baby move, strong kicks and rolls that made both her and Callum laugh with delight. He would spend long minutes with his hand on her stomach, feeling their child move, talking to it in his deep, gentle voice. They prepared a corner of the bedroom for the baby, building a cradle from smooth pine. Josephine sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small they were. Callum carved toys, his large hands surprisingly deft with the delicate work. In early June of 1877, Josephine's labor began. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when she was terrified. But Callum stayed with her throughout, holding her hand, wiping her brow, encouraging her with steady words. "You are so strong," he told her as another contraction racked her body. "You can do this, Josephine. I am right here. I am not going anywhere." When their son finally entered the world with a lusty cry, Callum cut the cord with shaking hands and helped clean the baby before placing him in Josephine's arms. "A boy," she breathed, looking down at the tiny, perfect face. "We have a son." "He is beautiful," Callum said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like his mama." They named him Thomas after Callum's father. He was a healthy, strong baby with his father's gray-blue eyes and his mother's dark hair. Callum was a devoted father from the very first moment, taking to it with the same focused intensity he brought to everything he cared about. Josephine watched him hold their son, this mountain of a man cradling the tiny infant with such gentleness, and fell even more deeply in love with him. The months that followed were exhausting but filled with joy. Thomas was a good baby, but he still required constant care. Josephine was amazed at how naturally Callum took to fatherhood. He would walk the floor with Thomas when he fussed, sing to him in his deep voice, change his diapers without complaint. "I never expected you to help so much with baby care," Josephine admitted one evening as she watched Callum rock Thomas to sleep. "Why not?" Callum asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "He is my son too. You should not have to do everything alone." "Most men would not see it that way." "Most men are fools," Callum said bluntly, making her laugh. As Thomas grew from infant to baby to toddler, their life settled into a new rhythm. Callum continued his trapping and hunting, but he always made time for his family. He taught Thomas to walk, to identify animals and plants, to be gentle with living things. Josephine had never imagined such domestic happiness existed. She had gone from a life of fear and servitude to one of love and partnership, and the contrast still sometimes took her breath away. When Thomas was 2 years old, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Callum was just as attentive and excited as he had been the first time. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1879, a quiet, calm baby they named Sarah, after Callum's sister. When Callum first held her, Josephine saw tears streaming down his weathered face. "She would have loved this," he said quietly. "My sister. She would have loved to see me happy, to meet my children." "Tell her about Sarah," Josephine suggested gently. "Tell our Sarah about the aunt she was named for." And he did, sharing stories of his sister's kindness and laughter, keeping her memory alive for their daughter. Life continued its steady course. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic boy who idolized his father and followed him everywhere. Sarah was quieter, more thoughtful, with her mother's gentle nature. Callum loved them both fiercely, and they adored him in return. Josephine sometimes thought back to that day on the auction block, to the terror and despair she had felt. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like it had happened to a different person. She barely recognized the frightened, beaten-down girl she had been. In her place was a confident woman, secure in her husband's love, fulfilled in her role as wife and mother. One evening when Thomas was 6 and Sarah was 4, they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. The children were playing in the yard, their laughter ringing through the clear air. Callum had his arm around Josephine, and she leaned into his solid warmth. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Spending all that money on me, tying yourself to someone you barely knew." Callum turned to look at her, genuine surprise on his face. "Regret? Josephine, buying your freedom was the best decision I have ever made. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. Even with all the work, all the responsibility, especially with that," he said firmly. "You gave me a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me love, family, happiness. How could I ever regret that?" She smiled and kissed him, still amazed after all these years that this wonderful man was hers. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," he replied, "more than I can ever express." As they sat there together, watching their children play, Josephine felt a deep sense of peace. She had come so far from that scared girl in shackles. She had found not just freedom, but love, home, and belonging. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, learning to trap and hunt and survive in the wilderness. Sarah became skilled in household arts, but also learned to shoot and ride, much to her mother's amusement. When Thomas turned 10, Callum began teaching him to read and write more seriously, using the books in his collection. Sarah, only 8 but fiercely determined not to be left behind, joined the lessons. Josephine watched with pride as her children learned, grateful that they would have opportunities she had never had. In the summer of 1885, when Thomas was 8 and Sarah 6, Josephine gave birth to their third child, another boy they named William. He was a happy, easy baby, and his siblings doted on him. Callum, now 34, still had the same muscular strength and vitality he had possessed when Josephine first met him, though there were threads of silver appearing in his dark hair. He still chopped wood with the same powerful strokes, still carried Josephine to bed when she fell asleep by the fire, still made her feel cherished and desired. "I hope our sons grow up to be like you," Josephine told him one night as they lay together, William asleep in his cradle nearby. "I hope they are better than me," Callum replied. "Kinder, wiser, braver." "Impossible," she said, kissing his jaw. "You set the standard too high." He smiled and pulled her closer. "You are biased." "I am honest," she corrected. As William grew, the family dynamic shifted again. Thomas, now a young man of 13, took pride in being a big brother, helping care for William and teaching him things. Sarah, at 11, was becoming a young woman, thoughtful and caring like her mother, but with her father's quiet strength. One afternoon in the fall of 1890, Thomas came running into the cabin, excitement written all across his face. He was 15 now, tall and broad-shouldered, looking more like Callum every day. "Pa, Ma, come quick." They rushed outside to find a horse standing in the clearing, saddled but riderless. Callum approached it carefully, checking for injuries. He found a saddle bag with papers inside, and his face grew serious as he read. "What is it?" Josephine asked. "These are land deeds," Callum said slowly. "For the property surrounding ours. It looks like someone was trying to claim it but never made it to file the paperwork." "What does that mean?" Thomas asked. "It means we can file the claim ourselves," Callum explained. "Expand our property. It would give us more land for the children, for when they grow up and want to build their own homes nearby." Josephine looked around at the mountains, the forest, the clear streams. "Thomas might want to stay here, if he wants," Callum said, looking at his son. "Or Sarah. Or William. This land could support multiple families if we work together." Thomas's face lit up. "I would like that, Pa. I cannot imagine living anywhere else." So they filed the claim, and their property expanded. Thomas, showing the same work ethic as his father, helped clear land and build a second cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house. It was meant for him when he was older, when he might have a family of his own. But Thomas was in no hurry to leave. He was content learning from his father, hunting and trapping, exploring the mountains he loved. Sarah, meanwhile, had become an accomplished rider and shot. She could track almost as well as Thomas, though she preferred working with the horses and the garden. At 13, she was blossoming into a beautiful young woman, with her mother's dark hair and her father's striking eyes. William, at 7, was the entertainer of the family, always laughing, always getting into mischief in the most innocent ways. He kept them all smiling. Josephine, now 34, still could not believe the life she had built. She looked at her husband, still strong and devoted after 14 years of marriage, at her 3 healthy, happy children, at the home they had created together, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. One winter evening, with the whole family gathered around the fire, Callum told the children the story of how he and Josephine had met. He had told them bits and pieces before, but never the whole truth. Thomas and Sarah listened with wide eyes as he described the auction, the purchase, the journey to the cabin. "You bought Ma?" Thomas asked, trying to understand. "I did," Callum admitted. "Not to own her, but to free her, to give her a choice about her life. And you chose Pa?" Sarah asked her mother. "I chose your father," Josephine confirmed. "Because he was kind and good and treated me with respect, because he made me feel safe, and because I fell in love with him." "We are very lucky," Callum added, looking at Josephine with the same love he had shown on their wedding day. "That we found each other, that we built this family. Never take that for granted." William, too young to fully understand but old enough to sense the importance of the moment, climbed into his father's lap. "I love you, Pa, and Ma." "We love you too, son," Callum said, his voice thick. "We love all of you more than you can possibly know." As the fire crackled and the snow fell softly outside, the family sat together, bound by love and gratitude. It was a perfect moment, one Josephine knew she would treasure forever. Time marched on, as it always does. Thomas grew into manhood, skilled and capable, a credit to his father's teaching. At 20, he married a young woman named Elizabeth from a ranch 20 miles away, a strong, smart girl who fit seamlessly into their family. They moved into the cabin Thomas had helped build, and within a year, they made Callum and Josephine grandparents with the birth of a daughter named Mary. Sarah, at 18, was being courted by several young men from the area, but she was in no hurry to marry. She enjoyed her independence, working with the horses and helping her mother. William, now 12, was growing fast, all gangly limbs and boundless energy. He talked about seeing more of the world someday, maybe traveling east, and while the thought pained Callum and Josephine, they understood the desire. Callum was 44 now, his hair liberally streaked with silver, his face lined from years of weather and laughter. But he was still strong, still capable, still the same steadfast man Josephine had married. One afternoon in the summer of 1895, Callum came in from working and found Josephine sitting on the porch, looking out at the mountains. He sat beside her, taking her hand. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything," she said softly. "How different my life could have been, how different it is." "Any regrets?" "Not a single one," she said firmly. "You gave me everything, Callum. Freedom, love, family, home. You saved my life in every way a person can be saved." "You saved mine too," he reminded her. "I was existing, not living, before you came. You brought joy back into my world." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of their land. In the distance, they could hear Thomas and Elizabeth laughing with baby Mary. Sarah was in the corral, working with a young horse. William was somewhere in the woods, exploring. "We made a good life," Josephine said. "We did," Callum agreed. "And we are not done yet." He was right. Sarah eventually married a rancher named David when she was 21, a good man who treated her well and made her happy. They built a home on the southern edge of the property, and soon gave Callum and Josephine 2 more grandchildren to dote on. William did travel east when he turned 18, spending 2 years seeing the country before returning to the mountains he loved. He settled on the property as well, building his own cabin and eventually marrying a schoolteacher from Laramie. By the time Callum and Josephine celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1901, they were surrounded by children and grandchildren. The mountain property that had once housed only one lonely man now supported 3 families, all connected by blood and love. On their anniversary, the whole family gathered at the original cabin for a celebration. Thomas had shot a deer, Sarah had baked pies, and William had brought gifts from town. The grandchildren, 5 of them now ranging from infant to 10 years old, played and laughed. After dinner, Callum stood and raised his glass. "25 years ago, I married the best woman I have ever known. Josephine, you have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. You have blessed me with children and grandchildren, with love and partnership and joy. Every day with you has been a gift." Josephine felt tears slip down her cheeks as she stood and embraced her husband. "I love you," she whispered. "Always and forever." "Always and forever," he echoed. Their children and grandchildren cheered, and the celebration continued into the evening. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Josephine looked around at her family and felt complete. The years continued to be kind to them. Callum remained strong and healthy, though he did less of the heavy work now, leaving that to his sons and sons-in-law. He spent more time with his grandchildren, teaching them the same skills he had taught their parents, filling their heads with stories and their hearts with love. Josephine, in her 50s now, still managed the main household with efficiency, though she too had slowed down. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her body bore the marks of years of work and childbearing, but Callum still looked at her the way he had on their wedding day, with wonder and devotion. In the winter of 1906, Callum fell ill with pneumonia. For the first time in their 30 years together, Josephine faced the possibility of losing him. She nursed him with fierce determination, barely leaving his side, forcing broth down his throat, bathing his fevered skin. Their children came to help, taking turns sitting with their father, praying for his recovery. Thomas, now 31 and the eldest, was especially shaken by his father's illness. "He has always been so strong," he said to his mother. I cannot imagine a world without him." "Neither can I," Josephine admitted, her voice breaking. "But we have to believe he will recover. He is too stubborn to leave us yet." And he was. Slowly, painfully, Callum fought his way back to health. By spring, he was up and moving around again, though weaker than before. Josephine watched him carefully, seeing the toll the illness had taken. One evening, as they sat together by the fire, Callum took her hand. "I am not as young as I used to be," he said quietly. "None of us are," Josephine replied. "I have been thinking," he continued, "about what happens when I am gone. I want to make sure you are taken care of, that the children know how to divide the property fairly." "Do not talk like that," Josephine said sharply, fear making her voice harsh. "You are not going anywhere. Josephine." He cupped her face gently. "We all go eventually. I am 55 years old. I have lived a good, long life. I am not afraid of death, but I am afraid of leaving you unprepared." Tears streamed down her face. "I do not want to think about it. I know, but we must." He pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I want you to know that every single day with you has been a blessing. You are the love of my life, Josephine. My partner, my best friend, my heart. And when my time comes, I will go knowing I was the luckiest man alive." She clung to him, sobbing. "I love you so much. I cannot lose you." "You will never lose me," he promised. "Even when I am gone, I will always be with you. In our children, our grandchildren, in every corner of this land we built together. I will always be with you." But death was not ready for Callum yet. He recovered his strength over the months that followed, and life returned to normal. He lived to see William marry and have his first child. He lived to see Sarah's youngest graduate from school. He lived to welcome 2 more great-grandchildren into the world. In the fall of 1910, as Callum and Josephine sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to her with a smile. "It is a beautiful evening," he said. "It is," she agreed, holding his hand. "I want you to know something," he said. "I have no regrets, none. This life we have built, this family, everything we have been through together, it has all been perfect." "Not perfect," she corrected gently, "but very, very good." "Perfect for me," he insisted. "You are perfect for me." That night, Callum passed away peacefully in his sleep, Josephine beside him as she had been for 34 years. He was 59 years old. The grief was devastating. Josephine felt as though half of herself had been torn away. Their children and grandchildren rallied around her, supporting her through the darkest days, but nothing could fill the void Callum left. They buried him on a hill overlooking the valley, with a simple marker bearing his name and the dates of his life. The whole community came to pay their respects, testimony to the good man he had been. In the months that followed, Josephine slowly learned to live with her grief. She remained in the cabin, surrounded by memories of Callum, finding comfort in the life they had built. Her children and grandchildren visited frequently, filling the empty spaces with noise and love. One evening, as Josephine sat by the fire, she picked up one of Callum's journals. He had kept them sporadically over the years, recording important events and thoughts. She opened it to a random page and began to read. "Today I asked Josephine to marry me." The entry from August 1876 read. "She said yes. I still cannot believe it. This woman, so brave and beautiful and kind, has agreed to be my wife. I am the luckiest man alive. I swear I will spend every day of my life making her happy, showing her she made the right choice. I will love her until my last breath and beyond." Tears streamed down Josephine's face, but they were not entirely sad tears. Callum had kept his promise. He had loved her, protected her, cherished her until his last breath. And she had done the same for him. She lived another 10 years, surrounded by her growing family. By the time she died peacefully in her sleep in 1920, at the age of 64, She had 7 grandchildren and 12 great-grandchildren. The mountain property was thriving, home to 3 generations who all carried the legacy of Callum and Josephine's love. They buried her beside Callum on the hill, finally reuniting them. Their children carved a new inscription below their names. Together they built a legacy of love, and they had. From a transaction on an auction block, from an act of compassion and courage, had grown a family tree that would continue for generations. The children and grandchildren would tell stories of the mountain man who bought a runaway girl's freedom and the woman who saved him from loneliness, of the love that grew between them, of the life they built together in the wild mountains of Wyoming. It was a love story for the ages, born in darkness but blooming into light, a testament to the power of kindness, of choice, of 2 souls finding each other against all odds. And though Callum and Josephine were gone, their love lived on in every descendant who walked the land they had claimed, in every couple who faced hardship together with courage and devotion, in every act of compassion shown to a stranger in need. The story of the mountain man and his beloved would echo through time, a reminder that love can transform everything, that one act of kindness can change the world, and that the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most beautiful endings. On that hilltop in Wyoming, beneath the endless sky, Callum and Josephine rested together, their love story complete, their legacy secure, their promise of always and forever fulfilled in every possible way.